think there's a fascinating dichotomy that I think you might be referring to here, which is even in the approach of, or potential approaches of Chachamim towards the nations of the world, without mentioning any names, there have been certain rabbis, even rabbis with high profiles, who have tried to engage with the philosophy of the Gentiles, and by doing so explain Judaism. Now that I want to be careful how I phrase this, but regardless of whether we're going to see that as a negative or a positive, what ends up happening is that there's a type of apologetics which is working within the framework of the assumptions of the Gentiles. In other words, it's sort of like, on some level, there's almost like an assumption that, well, you have these basic assumptions which are correct, and I'm going to show you how Judaism really fits in with them.
Yeah.
As compared to a situation which perhaps has existed among certain other rabbis and undoubtedly will exist, where maybe coming more from the direction, not from a rabbi existing in living in exile and taking that former approach that I just described, taking an approach from Eretz Yisrael where we're not trying to necessarily engage in apologetics based on your Gentile assumptions, but we are trying to simply tell you this is what Judaism says, regardless of whether it works out within your assumptions.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very delicate balance, because obviously, to some degree, in order to communicate and to have an impact, there needs to be translation. And that translation can be, in some ways and in some cases, a positive thing. Like if we couch everything in terms that are only comprehensible to people who are kind of already inside the system and plugged into it and committed to it, then far fewer people get to sort of benefit from the insight. But what's also true is that the moment that you start to engage in translation, you have to be very careful where your foundation lies, because you can begin by trying to, let's say, articulate what is compelling about the teaching of the Torah in terms that will seem accessible to someone who has a tendency to judge things in ways that, follow certain kinds of philosophical arguments. And then you can end, either by accident or with a kind of committed decision to change where you're planting your feet, by saying, well, really, the way that we justify things in these terms is with the philosophical principles. And look, I've shown that this piece of the Torah kind of conforms to that set of principles and what it teaches. And the problem is that it will never be the case that all of the Torah is derivable from some philosophical position that starts outside the framework of Torah. You can get parts of it that way, and understand parts of how it works that way. But if you start with a philosophy outside of Torah, it's always going to be too simple, and it's always going to, as a result, in a sense, imply a slippery slope to idolatry of some kind. And at the bottom of that slope, you're going to end up being very angry at some other part of the Torah for not conforming to the demands of the idol, so to speak. And I think that this is something that we get from our tradition, to, in various ways. Like there's a statement in the Gemara, it might be a Mishnah actually, that there's a question of whether we're permitted to study the wisdom of the Greeks. And there are those who have tried to claim, I think, that the wisdom of the Greeks there is actually referring to a specific kind of esoteric, mystical Greek teaching, like Pythagorean mysticism or something like that. And it's a specific question of, like, can we study that subject? And it's not saying, like, can we learn any kind of wisdom from the Greeks at all, like the fact that the sun stays in the sky for longer during the summer or something like that. But leaving that interpretation aside, if we just take it as the wisdom of the Greeks as a whole, there's an opinion from Rabbi Yishmael that says you you can only study the wisdom of the Greeks when it is neither night nor day. And that sounds at first like a categorical answer saying that you can't, right? It sounds like a sort of flowery way of saying it's forbidden. But I think it's such a brilliant passage from Chazal because it isn't actually categorically saying that you can't study it. And to see that it's leaving open the possibility of studying it, you have to also see that it's kind of making fun of Greek philosophy on the one hand, and also employing your knowledge of halakha on the other. Because Greek philosophy is very logical. And it's the idea is that you start with some set of assumptions and then based on those assumptions, you can kind of prove theorems that are consequences of them, like very Euclidean, very Pythagorean. I mean, that's actually mathematics, but there's a lot of associated Greek philosophy that's similarly logical in this way. And so this idea of, well, I can prove that since all time is either night or day, that if he says that it has to be neither night nor day, then there is no time which I can, and therefore it must be forbidden. But of course, so it's kind of poking fun at Greek philosophy a little bit, because in halakha, in Jewish law, of course, we have the idea of ben hashmashot, right? That there is time between the when the sun goes down, which is shkiat hachama, and when the stars are coming out, which is tzedek uchavim. There's this halakhic category of time called ben hashmashot, and maybe you could argue that ben hashmashot is kind of like a defined time, which is twilight, which is neither night nor day. And I'm not saying that like practical halakha should be that you can only study Greek philosophy during Ben Mashot. That would be kind of odd, and no one certainly makes a ruling of halakha that that's the case. But the reason I think it's significant is because what else do we associate it with that period, right? Like, what are we either having just done or are about to do in Ben Mashot, either in the morning or in the evening? It's about Kriyat Shema, right? It's about affirming the oneness of God. The mitzvah, where we're required to affirm the oneness of God, the Zman for Kriyat Shema, where we can do the mitzvah of Kriyat Shema, is associated with this transition from day to night or from night to day. And as a result, Rabbi Yishmael is even kind of referring to the idea that maybe you are safer in studying the wisdom of the Greeks if you are properly anchored in the fact that you are regularly declaring the oneness of God, and you're not going to be sort of pulled down the slippery slopes to different kinds of idolatries. And also, if you are kind of sophisticated enough to appreciate that the question of whether something is either night or day is one in halakha. So that's just one source that I think treats this issue, but I think it's more generally something that you can see in the tradition, that you want to be open to foreign ways of thinking enough that you can benefit from that kind of exchange and that commerce. The Mikdash of Shlomo HaMelech was built with cedars from Tzor that were given by King Hiram, who was a friend of David and of Shlomo. And so you with the right kind of openness, you can build the Mikdash with trade and with wealth and with wisdom that you can gain from a healthy relationship to the outside world. But that relationship has to, from the standpoint of Torah, be rooted in confidence in one's relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the Torah that he's given us. And it becomes, as it does also in Tanakh, very problematic when instead you're saying, well, the people in Tzor are saying this, and we need to let them open up their shops in Yerushalayim on Shabbat, because otherwise we might lose our relationship with them. And so we need to start bending in their direction and sort of worrying about how to please their gods, which culminates in the case of, I mean, this is not about Hellenism exactly, but in the case of Achav, Melech Israel, when he marries Izebel, the princess from Sidon, and he's bringing the gods of foreign nations to the land of Israel, and sort of wholesale jettisoning the commitment to Torah and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So it's a very complicated balance, but it's one that we can't approach by simply being closed off. And on the other hand, it's one where we don't want the philosophy to be the foundation.
I was also thinking how this connects to the principles of Torah, Eretz Yisrael, and Geula. The idea that, and again, I'm not saying this to negate what you were saying about the importance of being able to engage with the philosophies emerging from outside of Israel. But once we've reached a stage which have begun to reach of starting to come back to Torah Eretz Yisrael, a more holistic and comprehensive Judaism, which includes all sorts of things which were not part of Judaism in the exile. So we have a whole different situation, which enables us to shift to a footing more based on that self-confidence and holistic approach and comprehensive Judaism that enables us to not only engage but also come out much more powerfully and clearly from a uniquely Jewish position.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that I think you're getting at something very important, which is that there certainly are things that the Torah wants us to be able to teach the world about how to build a godly society that we can exemplify if we do it right in our own society, and then others can learn from that example, and we can talk about it and we can learn about it together with the nations of the world. And as long as Am Yisrael were not in the land, it was a lot harder to see that because Jews were living all over the place in other societies. And it seemed like no matter what, the conversation was always just about what that society should be like. Like either Jews were, so to speak, like Yonah, like asleep in the bottom of the boat and not concerned with how the society that they were in should be run, which was in many cases probably the case over the eons, or Jews were getting very involved in how things were run or making suggestions about how things should be run. Like if you look in America in the present day, American Jewry are very interested in American politics and often produce people who have a lot of opinions about what should be better or worse. But I think there's often some confusion about, okay, I have the Torah, but should I be reading the Torah and saying, well, the Torah enjoins this upon Am Yisrael living in their land. So does that mean every other nation should do exactly the same thing in their own land? Like, for example, should other nations keep Shemitah, like the 7-year cycle of agriculture? Is that something that we do in our land because it's part of a kind of universal morality where every nation should have a 7-year agricultural cycle? So the same way that the Torah tells us not to steal and not to murder, and we would tell other people, you also shouldn't steal and murder in your society, that it's also, yeah, we have 7 years of, or 6 years of farming the land, and then 7 years we let it lie fallow, and that's actually like all people should do that? Or alternatively, could it be the case that that is a practice that shows the Kiddusha of Am Yisrael, that it's about our priestly nature as a nation, that we're supposed to be like a differently restricted nation that has priestly qualities, which put Hashem's name on us and give us a sort of mission to speak. And there may be things to learn from what we're doing, but that doesn't necessarily mean that what we're trying to teach the world is simply, yep, we should all keep Shemitah, or we should all not wear wool and linen, woven together, or what have you. But I think that probably most of all American Jews are often confused by this, where the things that they think that they're learning from the Torah, they're not seeing themselves as Jews in a society of goyim who should be asking, let's say, what message does this society need to hear from Am Yisrael, given that these laws have been given to us for our society in our land? Rather, they're saying, okay, I have the Torah here, and I'm not in the land of Israel. I'm here in this land. So, what's the sort of society I could imagine here in this land that would most resemble the one that I'm supposed to be living in according to the Torah? And I'll kind of make recommendations on that basis. It's too often the case, I think, that kind of confused approach gets taken, and I think it would be much more powerful if more Jews in diaspora could speak with the confidence of saying, the model for a society that I learned from my tradition is for the society in Eretz Yisrael that Jews are supposed to be living in there. And I have a lot that I understand from that model that I can teach you about HaKadosh Baruch Hu and what he wants. And then if you understand that, then you can figure out how to organize your society so that you can base it on the right kind of relationship with him. I think that would be the kind of message that could have more success.
Yeah, it also it'd be quite intuitive to say that not everything that we do here in Israel, or should be doing in Israel, should be seen as symmetrical. And this is just saying again in another way what you were saying. It should not be seen as symmetrical to what should be done there, both in terms of governance, how democratic the regime should be, or less democratic the regime should be. It doesn't what might be appropriate here according to the Torah doesn't mean the same thing is applicable in a symmetrical type of way over there.
Yeah, and I mean that's a very current discussion here with the recent elections, which this brings us kind of to the other side of the same coin, which is there also can be a lot of confusion on the part of Jews living in Eretz Yisrael that derives from a misplaced desire to properly import or model the ideals of other societies, and to do that at any cost. I think that sometimes, the discussion about forms of government and all of that can be very alarming to people who are accustomed to living in very, worldly and modern and sort of Western style societies. When you just sort of go to the Mishneh Torah with Rambam and start talking about oh, well, what does Rambam say about if there were a king, et cetera, et cetera? I don't think we have to talk about any of those things. Those are very pertinent discussions if you want to kind of cover all the cases that Halakha considers. But I think talking more in general terms, right now there's a lot of rhetoric going around in Israel about Israeli democracy and whether Israeli democracy is being upended or overturned or threatened by planned changes to some of the laws of the country that are going to be passed by the new Knesset. And I think what's funny about that discussion, well, a lot of things are. One of them is that the term democracy is not really used with its literal meaning very often, because democracy, at least, I don't know, as I was taught it when I was learning civics growing up in the United States, I think of it as being about the degree to which you make decisions about law and sort of give power to legislate and regulate based on majority rule. You're going to have these votes, these plebiscites where you decide things based on counting number of people in favor and against, and that there are different kinds of democratic republics that you can design that have more or less direct democracy in different parts of how they operate. And I think what's happening right now with discussions about, the Supreme Court in Israel and judicial reform and other things like that, it could be perhaps likened, for example, to a period in the history of the United States, let's say, where initially the Senate was not directly elected by the people as it is now. So the senators didn't used to be selected by direct elections where a majority vote within their state send the senators, but that was true of the congressmen. And then a change was made, and now senators are directly elected. And someone at the time, when that change was made, might have said, this is a travesty, this is an upending of our way of governing. I think if they were being precise and accurate, they wouldn't have said this is being less democratic. They would have said it's being more democratic, but there were concerns in the designing of the US Constitution about how dangerous direct democracy was and the need to balance that to protect different kinds of constituencies or minorities or interest groups, so that you have like separate states that each get 2 senators, even though they have far fewer people than other states that have a much greater population. So you design a system, and then there's different things that have, you see advantages and disadvantages and different choices that you make in the design. But always it's true when you change the design, you're changing the way things operate, and that can be a little bit alarming. But it's technically the case that it will make, if judicial reforms of the kinds that are being proposed right now go through, where there's more direct oversight or choice and selection of who sits on the Supreme Court in Israel by elected representatives, that will make things more democratic. But what people mean when they say that threatens what they're calling Israeli democracy, what they really mean by that is either in one sense that they're worried that Israel, which is a Western style liberal democracy, may become a bit less liberal. Like it might still be a democracy, but it might be a democratic republic whose outcomes seem less liberal as a result. And that is a concern. But because democracy is a buzzword that everyone just raises as kind of an idol, where you say if something is a democracy, then it's good, and if it isn't a democracy, then it's bad. I think the rhetoric just collapses into this very distortive way of talking, where people are saying, "Oh, we're going to destroy our democracy by making it slightly more democratic and changing the balance of power in a system with some checks and balances in it." When in reality, we're really having a discussion about how Western and how liberal a democracy Israel should be. And what pains me in this whole discussion is that I think that there are many different systems of government that can be conceived that are more or less democratic, or that are this way or that way. But what one would hope is that the discussion could originate at least from the idea that we have a tradition and a civilization that is rich enough and deep enough and broad enough that we can learn from it and design whatever system of government, whatever, let's say, system of democratic government that we want, in a way that doesn't worry about what the other nations will say, or whether we are being consistent with the principles expounded by their philosophers. But I think that, unfortunately, in the current era, there's far too much concern about, so to speak, whether whatever system of government we're operating with here, whether it's going to produce results that seem sufficiently palatable or appealing to the standards that have been set by other Western liberal democracies like the United States. And I'll just add as the last point, that the hilarious thing is that at the same time, I think that the debate here and the people here for the most part understand very little about how the American system of democracy works and don't realize the degree to which the system here is less democratic than the American system in the literal sense, meaning like it leaves less up to the votes of like majority votes of different constituencies, and also has fewer checks and balances than said system. And so there's this kind of desire on the one hand to bow to the judgments of foreign societies like the US and worrying that they're going to point at us and say, we're not a good enough democracy anymore. And yet at the same time, also, I find there's very little knowledge about or interest in what the American system is and how it works. And there's no discussion of whether that is something we should be trying to mimic or not. And I would, rather than try to mimic that system, I would say, let's start the discussion from our own tradition and see where that leads us, because there's a lot that we can learn, and we shouldn't assume that we have to get it from James Madison or Socrates.
It's also interesting how, in the name of this fight to preserve democracy, seemingly the most ferocious attacks are being justified. That the ideological basis is being formed by these people who are being so shrill about the end of Israeli democracy. It's there's an ideological basis being created to justify engaging in serious and obnoxious attacks on.
Well, yeah, and I mean the irony is that obviously all rhetoric that claims democracy is under attack is partly employed in order to justify extreme measures that are supposedly the only thing that can be done in order to save something, right? Like that you're trying to save the system, and in order to save the system, you should be willing to go to any extreme, and therefore maybe not act in the way one normally does, which is to say that you accept that the way that the system is agreed upon to operate, you have to kind of play within those boundaries and work within those lines, and that itself is corrosive. Like many people have observed this, because I think it's also it's become a very shrill argument for a different reason and of a different kind in the American system as well, where both sides are constantly questioning the validity of outcomes of elections, or questioning whether the system is fundamentally sound, or whether it's being undermined and destroyed and threatened in an existential way that requires extraordinary measures in order to save it. But of course, such extraordinary measures are, from another perspective, exactly the same thing as threatening to destroy the system. And so it's a very destabilizing echo chamber when people start talking this way. But it feels to me to be a particularly silly thing for people to get caught up in here, because at least in America, you could say that the American democracy, in a sense, is the common religion of all of America. Like that is what makes America America. It has nothing else that binds together all the people who are there than some kind of belief in the ingeniousness of this political system for resolving differences peacefully. And it has worked brilliantly for hundreds of years. And it is an amazing achievement of human wisdom that is to be marveled at, like many things. But it is more questionable whether the Israeli democracy deserves the same kind of congratulation for the brilliance of its design. And that doesn't mean that it all should be scrapped in favor of Tsarism or some other kind of despotism. But it does mean that we have much less reason here to worship the system itself as it is currently constructed. And moreover, we have much more in common with each other as a society of a people, the majority of whom all come from ancestors who carried the Torah with them in exile for over 1,000 years and close to 2,000 years. And the Torah is not uninterested in questions of law and politics and whatever else. And that doesn't mean that like you can use it like a sort of just add water way of producing a modern day theocracy, and that shouldn't be the goal. And it should be thought about very carefully how to do things by consensus and do things that make use of all the sort of wisdom that's been discovered about how to create orderly and peaceful societies around the world that we can benefit from. But again, it comes back to the question of where you plant your feet. And you know, I think that there just are specific examples that can be pointed out where you just say, this is where it becomes crucially important for us to actually look what the Torah or what Tanakh or what our tradition is teaching us, instead of receiving blindly a set of standards that are being handed to us by a society that had, so to speak, different gods when it set up these standards. So one example, free speech. You know, so free speech is clearly something in America that is as highly sacrosanct as possible. Like, it's hard to think of another society in the world or in human history that has done more to protect freedom of speech and expression. And that's been hugely beneficial to America in a lot of ways. It has made America a particularly safe place for Jews to flourish in the last century. And there's a lot to be said for that. However, there also are things in free speech that the society is really grappling with right now, because of the internet and all these things that technology can change about what it means to speak and to express things. And everyone's getting kind of overwhelmed with all the things that can happen and not knowing, and you end up producing both unreasonable calls for the abridgment of speech that don't make sense, and that are clear grabs for power, but which suddenly people are more willing to listen to because they're frightened of all the changes that are happening and all the things that technology is doing to change, you know, what speech can do. And then at the same time, also, you have all of these ironclad protections for speech and expression that can't be questioned. And that there is a sort of lowest common denominator that produces, where it has to, at some level, be a society that has no ability to regulate blasphemy. And that has a corrosive effect in the end, right? That if you have a society that does not have a way of giving honor to or protecting the name of the world's creator, then you do over time create a different condition in terms of how possible it is for someone to make an oath that carries weight, or how willing people are to do things that threaten humanity as a whole, because they don't, they're not worried about society as a whole having respect for the human being as the image of God, things like that. And I noticed, you know, when I think about the example of free speech, and the study that you can find in Tanakh, it's interesting that so when King David is kind of done defeating Shaul and he's king, there's a guy who comes and curses him. So this is in Shmuel Bet. It says, "Uva melech David ad Bahurim, v'hine misham ish yotzeh mimishpachat Bet Shaul, shemo Shimei, ben Gera yotzeh yatzor u'mekalel." So David came to Bahurim, and he was by the house of the family of Shaul, and there was this guy named Shimei, who was son of Gera, and he came out cursing him. Vayisakel ba'avanim et David. So he threw stones at David. Ve'et kol avdei hamelech David, ve'kol ha'am, ve'kol hagiburim, mimeno umismono. So he was throwing stones at David, and all the servants of King David and all the people and all the mighty men were on his right and on his left. Or Amar Shimei bekalelo tze ish hadamim ve'ish habliyal heshiv alecha Adonai kol dmei Beit Shaul asher malachta tachtav vayiten Adonai et melucha biyad Avshalom binecha v'hinecha b'ra'atecha ki ish damim ata. So the Lord has returned upon you all the blood of the house of Shaul, in whose place you've reigned, and the Lord has delivered the kingdom to the hand of Avshalom your son, and behold, you are in evil plight because you're a bloody man. So bottom line, Abishai, the right-hand man of David, comes to him and says, "Why are you letting this guy curse you? Let me kill him." And what does David say? Vayomer HaMelech, Mali velachem b'nei Tzuria, ko yikalel, ki Adonai amar lo, kalel et David omi yomar madua asita ken. So the king said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Tzuria? So let him curse, because the Lord has said to him to curse David. Who shall then say, why have you done so? So David is showing here tremendous tolerance, right? He's not just being cursed by this guy. This guy's throwing stones at him. And David is saying, leave him alone. Don't kill him. But the key thing here is that this guy isn't just cursing him. He's cursing him in the name of Hashem, right? That this guy Shimei specifically invokes the idea that it is HaKadosh Baruch Hu that is punishing David. So he's speaking to the king, but seeking to do so in a way that puts Hashem front and center and claims that it is Hashem's judgment that is the reason that David should be cursed. So David may not agree, but he'll tolerate that. And David, in his response, mentions the fact that Shimei is speaking, Hashem has said to make him curse me. I don't know that this would go the same way if you had some guy throwing stones and cursing David because he was Goliath's brother or whatever, right? Like there are other things that you can do, or let's say he was a Jew, but he was a friend of Goliath's or whatever. There are things that you can do that cross certain lines, and there always is a question of where the line is to be drawn. So in the United States, for example, if you threaten to assassinate the president, then you can be arrested, even though that's speech, right? Or if you incite violence, then you can be arrested. So everyone draws their line somewhere. And what our tradition seems to be interested in, as far as some of the drawing of lines, is, are people having disagreements based on their arguments for what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants, or are they having their disagreements along other lines? And I'm not trying to elaborate a whole theory of how to, regulate or not regulate speech. But what I'm trying to point to is that you could just blindly take a principle like this from a Western society and import it and say, well, this is how they handle, free speech in the United States, and we can't deviate from that, or else we'll be accused of not being a democracy. But the truth is that every democracy has decisions to make about how to handle it. In fact, Israel doesn't have the same standards of speech as in the US. There's a lot more lawsuits for libel in Israel, for example, because the standard of jurisprudence for it is different. So it's always going to be different. And I think we're going to succeed when we're trying to define those differences for ourselves in ways that draw on what we learn from our Torah about what really matters. And the more instead that we are either trying to directly imitate something they're doing in Britain or in the USA, because we can't imagine coming up with something more correct ourselves, or the more we're doing something even more confused, which is hoping we can preserve a system that isn't like those systems because it has produced results that we think our allies like, and we don't want to disturb them by making changes that would cause them to worry that the country is becoming more Judaic in its approach, even if in fact that would actually be a more democratic outcome. That way of doing things is going to just keep us tangling up in our own feet, and we do well to avoid it.
That also brings us back to what I was saying, that as time goes on and our return to Eretz Yisrael leads to a situation of greater self-confidence, comprehensive picture of Judaism, sense of Judaism, and clarity, that will be more willing to engage in the type of analysis that you were suggesting.
Yeah, I hope so. B'ezrat Hashem.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.